Well, welcome to the latest installment of Ty Burr's WatchCast, an audio offshoot of the Substack newsletter Ty Burr's Watch List. Today we have the ninth in our series of podcasts devoted to the classics of the new millennium. Conversations about those movies that have come out since the year 2000 and can legitimately or arguably be called great. To talk about the Coen brothers' 2007 masterpiece, No Country for Old Men, please welcome Isaac Feldberg. Isaac's part of a rising generation of talented young movie critics, and I'm pleased to have known him since he was a co-op in the arts section of the Boston Globe many years ago. Not that many years ago, but enough. He's been busy and visible ever since, having contributed to the Boston Globe, Fortune Magazine, and Entertainment Weekly. He's currently a freelance writer, critic, and editor based in Chicago, where he covers film and television for RogerEbert.com, The Playlist, Paste, and Filmmaker Magazine. You should seek out his byline. He is knowledgeable, erudite, and just a really good critic. And I'm delighted to have him on the podcast. So the day I asked Isaac what film he'd like to talk about as a 21st century modern classic, the news had just come that the legendary author Cormac McCarthy had died. So our conversation naturally turned to No Country for Old Men, the best adaptation of a McCarthy novel to make it to the screen. Although Isaac might argue with that. We'll talk about that. It was the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences pick for the Best Picture of 2007, and it's generally considered the crown jewel in the Coen brothers' filmography. So let me start off by asking you, Isaac, does this movie deserve the accolades? Does it hold up? I'm assuming you, like I did, watched it recently to prepare for this. What makes it so special?
Well, thank you, Ty, for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be here talking about No Country for Old Men, specifically because I agree with you. I think it's absolutely the finest adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's work that's made it to the screen. I did rewatch the film actually last night. I sat down with it and really just fell immediately back into it in a way that reaffirmed for me that it does have this hypnotic power that really only the great American films that I find that are associated with the West and with all of these mythic storytelling traditions that have that kind of power. I just was enthralled. And I've seen this film maybe three or four times. I had 3 or 4 times before, maybe even 5 times. And it just does that every time. It just has this power. And I trust that you found it similarly, since we're here and we're connecting for this one.
Yeah, I watched it I think I saw it twice when it came out in 2007. I haven't seen it since. And like you, I was pulled immediately back into it. And I want to talk about the way the movie does that. Literally the techniques by which the movie casts a very specific spell. But I also, it has one of the great endings of modern films. And I don't want to talk about it now, we'll get there, but I just was floored by that ending and put in such an emotional place that in a way that the movie sneaks up on you. It's rare that a film ends in a way that like you don't see the wallop coming and then you get the wallop. But we can talk about that further as we go. I'd like to ask you, first of all, I think we need to, for listeners unfamiliar with the film, need to go into a little bit of the plot, and feel free to chip in, with your own sort of thoughts about how it plays out. But it is based quite closely on the Cormac McCarthy novel. It is takes place in the West, in New Mexico, and it's about 3 characters essentially. A Vietnam vet. It takes place in the 1970s, early 1970s, and maybe 1970 itself. And one of the main characters is a welder and Vietnam vet named Llewellyn Moss, played by Josh Brolin, who, when he is out hunting in the desert, comes across a botched drug deal. Bodies everywhere, cars shot up, one dying survivor, and a bag full of $300,000 or $500,000. It's a lot of money. And he takes it, which puts the second character on his tail, a man named Anton Chigurh. Not Sugar.
That's right.
Chigurh.
Chigurh.
played by Javier Bardem in a role that won him an Oscar. One of the most unique villains in the history of film. Sort of following both of them is a aging sheriff, Ed Tom Bell, played by Tommy Lee Jones, who's sort of the conscience of the film. And the book, too. If you read the book, each chapter starts with a monologue by Ed Tom before going into the action. So that's, in sketch form, that's kind of it. There are other characters, but it really, kind of remarkably, it's just a chase film. And I'm curious whether... how you would categorize this if somebody said at gunpoint, tell me what genre film this is.
It's funny because I've heard No Country for Old Men described as a neo-Western before, and I think that holds water to a large degree. But I think, more than a neo-Western, it feels like this destruction of the Western in a way. Like there's this very apocalyptic quality to it that is shared across a lot of Cormac McCarthy's novels. And I would say there's this sort of cosmic collision with the Coen brothers and their interests in the No Country for Old Men adaptation, where you're watching these characters kind of go through the motions of a Western story, but the consequences are so much more dire and so much less heroic than you might associate with the tropes of that genre. And so it's an interesting question about the classification of the film, because to me, it has this almost biblical sort of tone to it in scripture, which won't be unfamiliar to fans of the Coen brothers. They do love to play little trickster gods in their film universes, but and for Cormac McCarthy as well, I just think that I think about this film as just an apocalyptic film. To me, it feels like it steps outside of the Western and it looks at it at its end point. It kind of looks upon the death of the Western in a way. And that's something that I think makes it very special. I think it accounts in part for that hypnotic pull that the film has that we've been talking about a little bit. Just because there's this constant sort of looming threat, this storm that is just kind of gathering in the film, that I think there's, through so many different kinds of cinematic techniques, it comes through. But it is one of those movies that just stands outside of its genre, in a sense. So I can say that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And it is about the destruction of the Western. To me, it's almost about the atomization of the Western. It's just pulling it apart into its constituent parts, which is something I think McCarthy intended, and based on some of the interviews I've read with the Coens that they gave back in 2007, is something that attracted them to this project. One of them is saying, I think Ethan is quoted as saying, we really responded to the way he played with genre because that's what we like to do. And they really responded to the word they used was the pitiless quality of the story. And you're right to say that, it's the Western at the end point. It's a Western without morality. Western morality recalled by the sheriff, but it doesn't exist in this film. Yes. One of the interesting things I think about it is in translating the book to the film, and I guess if you went back and went through the book, you'd notice this as well, but there are hardly any scenes, there's hardly any shots where any of the three characters are in the same shot together. In fact, there may not be any. And the story really subverts the Western by denying the audience some of those set piece scenes, including there's one scene where Tommy Lee Jones's character, Ed Tom Bell, walks into a room and he's silhouetted in the doorway. When we see they give us a shot of the shadow, and he looks like the shadow is of a gunslinger coming down Main Street. And that's the only touch it's such a smart shot, because it's like, yes, this is what this genre used to be about. This is what America used to be about. But no, it's just a shadow now.
Yes.
Do you see those? Go ahead.
Oh, completely. I think that shot, I'm so glad that you mentioned that one, because there are these moments where you see that archetypal figure, like the Western hero, but it's been reduced to this wraith, this shadow that just is playing on the wall. And you see that as well in the shot where Ed Tom Bell opens the door to this motel room and sees, himself on the wall. It's this incredible shot of just him towering over this completely haunted domestic interior. And it's just that kind of an inversion of that amazing shot in The Searchers, the John Ford shot of just the grand outdoors framed by the doorway. There's just this broken home that he's looking in on, and he towers over it. And you see in that moment that this character no longer has a place in that world, that it's completely changed on him. And I think that you're so right to say that it's a Western without morality, but that morality is recalled. It's really a dream in a lot of ways of, what the world was before this apocalypse that has arrived without a bang, just with this like quiet whimper, this little death that people just haven't quite noticed happening. And I think the fatalism of that is something that is very Cormac McCarthy, but the way that it's executed is very true to the Coens' ideas of, just as they put across in the film, all of these sort of recurring loops, these concentric circles that just kind of collide and collide and collide, and spell the doom of these characters.
Yeah. It's another example I'm thinking of is, you always get a shootout on Main Street in one of these things, and there is a shootout on Main Street, but it's at midnight. Nobody else is there, and it's chaotic, and the hunter becomes the hunted, and sides switch. And there's no. What's interesting is that it's a very formally shot film. The formalism in this film is incredible, but it really is about chaos and entropy, and the death of a version of America, and the death of America, if you want to take it that far.
Yes,
which. To McCarthy's and the Coens' credit, they never actually spell that out. They never say that. They don't have to. One of the strengths of the film is how oblique it is. It just hints at these things.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the technique, because it's such a specific style of narrative, so sparse, so inexorable. And yet the Coens find a visual equivalent of that. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think that this is when we were talking about what makes a great Cormac McCarthy adaptation. I think it is that sort of that sparseness, that narrative economy, and just this, I think, so much credit must be given to Roger Deakins, of course, who shot this film. He's just creating this version of the Southwest that is sweeping, but so cold, and in many ways so claustrophobic. There's this sort of dimension to it where, instead of ever opening the characters up to a new horizon, every new sort of set piece in this, every world that they sort of explore or try to kind of escape to, just becomes this other mousetrap for them to be hunted within. And I think so much of that is the film's use of shadow and light, just often just abstracted in a way. Like, I'm thinking of this amazing shot of light through the hole where a doorknob used to be, and which I'll say that way because it completely cuts off any escape, even when there is this light in the movie that comes. It's a very cold and cruel light of day. It's this kind of revelation rather than any sort of hope of daybreak or escape. It's just this kind of this long night and slivers of light that expose the characters rather than give them any sort of refuge from that darkness.
Nicely said. The editing, I think, also, which I believe Deakins didn't win an Oscar, although I believe he was nominated. The editing did win by Roderick Jaynes, which is the Coen brothers' nom de cutting room. But this time around, I really couldn't help noticing the editing, because it is It's brilliant. It's almost stately. I mean, this could have been a Tony Scott action movie. It could have been bam, 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 bam. But it's elegiac. The transitions between scenes are often lap dissolves, which is unusual today. There's you often will the sound and vision will overlap. You'll see the next scene before you hear it, or you hear the next scene before. So, as you say, there's this hypnotic quality that pulls you through the film, even when violent things are happening quite quickly. You never, in part because the camera work is not handheld or frenetic, it's quite formal.
It is.
You never get the sense that you're either being hustled from one scene to another, or that you're losing momentum. The momentum carries you through all the way, even when you don't understand what you don't understand the point of what you're being told, and you really don't truly understand the movie, I think, until its final scenes. But I'm thinking that there's an incredible action scene about 20 minutes in, when Llewellyn goes back stupidly with water to give to the surviving gangster, and is surprised by people who've shown up. And there is a terrifying chase scene in which they unleash a dog to chase him into a river. He basically runs off a cliff into a river, and there's an incredible shot of, and it's actually one of the few moving sort of handheld in that it's in the river. The camera is in the river in front of Josh Brolin as he's going down the river, and you see the dog in the rear ground just racing toward the camera. It's just a startling shot because you've never seen anything quite like that. But it's also dreamlike. It's also almost surreal. And that's something that McCarthy's prose does. I don't know if you've read, how many of his books you've read. I'm
in the middle of Stella Maris right now, but everything else. It's quite good. It's quite good. I mean, it's funny because I'm as I'm approaching it, I'm reluctant to finish this last book that he authored, and I'm tempted instead to go back to the beginning and start over. Yeah, just because I'm working on this theory that they are really chronological. Cormac McCarthy's books, which I was thinking about in connection with this one, because I think that this really is his apocalypse book. And then after it, he wrote The Road, which is his post-apocalypse book. And I think No Country for Old Men is his apocalyptic book, not Stella Maris. No. Yes. Okay. Yes. No Country for Old Men. Stella Maris. To me, it traces another circle in his writing. It goes back to the beginning of these very abstract ideas of language and of science that ultimately are just these sort of illusions of myth, in the same way that so many of the other archetypes he explores in his books are. Mm-hmm. But yes, I especially with Cormac McCarthy's passing recently, I've just been diving back into his work, and I am so struck by both the way that he wrote, which was so terse and violent. He hated punctuation, and I think that he was inspired more. People associate him with Faulkner, with all of these, with any classic novelist you would care to name, with Homer, with just these titans of literature. But I think that a lot of his style of writing is more akin to radio plays. There's just nothing but the dialogue. He's just he strips away all of these devices that you can use to stand between the character, their philosophy, their action, and I think that economy is something that the Coen brothers find a really powerful big screen cinematic equivalent of in No Country for Old Men, by relying so much on these atmospheres that we're talking about. I think that is their equivalent of stripping away the devices. It's just this kind of, and I think that in doing that, forgive me for going on a slight tangent with this, but one of the things I find so fascinating about the film is that in many ways it does play with these ideas and these themes that have recurred throughout Coen brothers filmography. I mean, it starts like so many of the others with this briefcase full of money. But I think the chase that occurs in this film, what happens after that money is discovered, it reduces it to this incredibly elemental form of that idea of what a briefcase full of money represents, which is kind of death or at least destruction, the end of something that you had in your life before. It radically changes everything, and just so many little details in this film. I'm thinking of the coin that Antoine Chigurh has as well, that he turns into this kind of ultimate force of life and death, is still just money. It's still just this currency. And I think that the Coen brothers have a lot of fun with that, with the idea of introducing these more elemental forms of these devices that have allowed them to make so many tricky, fascinating films set in the American past.
Yeah. I've often thought, and I thought anew when I was watching it again, that No Country is like an epic, tragic version of Fargo, or more specifically, given where it was shot, Blood Simple, their very first film. And it links to Raising Arizona, which is a Roadrunner cartoon compared to this.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
But like so many of their films, it explores chance, it explores fate, it explores coincidence, and where coincidence and chance are often farce or comedy in their movies. In this one, it's played deadly straight. And chance is really, to me, money represents chance in this film. And I think in all stories where there's a bag of money, where that's the MacGuffin, it's chance. It's the chance to escape. It's the chance that just falls in your lap. It's the chance that sends killers your way. And you're absolutely right. And I hadn't thought about, the coin. Yeah, sure. That's money as well. To me, when you have those scenes where Anton Chigurh basically flips a coin and the life of the person who calls heads or tails depends on what they call.
Call it. Call it, yes. For what? Just call it. Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
You need to call it. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it.
Well, that is, as Carla Jean, Llewellyn's wife, says at the end, that's your way of getting out of it. That's your way of not having responsibility. So I'm not going to call it. You have to make that choice yourself.
And it throws him off. It throws him off his game in that moment. I think, and you could interpret it that way, but I think that is one of the ways in which this adaptation is really a tremendous adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's book, is through the character of Carla Jean, in that they age her up a little bit. Kelly MacDonald gives her this sort of wounded intelligence and a resignation that she didn't really have fully, I think, in the book. And she really more forcefully than any other character in No Country for Old Men, she is able to stand her ground against Anton Chigurh by not begging and by not even, playing into his rhetorical argument about fate. She just sort of believes and really makes him see what Carson Wells, the bounty hunter played by Woody Harrelson, isn't really able to get across, is just like, you're crazy. You're a crazy man, Anton Chigurh. And, for you to be claiming that you are deaf is also this form of hubris that is also, I think it plays beautifully into the film's overall idea of the deconstruction of a Western hero and the deconstruction of a Western villain. At the end of the day, both of these gunslingers are completely, I think Chigurh considers himself an instrument, but I think that they really are just these objects that get thrown around by fate like anything else. And he, the car crash that occurs late in this film as well, I think, proves that to him in a way where, and Javier Bardem has this moment. I'm not sure if this is why he won the Oscar, but I love this scene where he is putting his arm in a sling and just completely sort of rattled. You can see this look on his face where he actually just has no idea what just happened. And he and I love that the Coens find a way to sort of root back to an earlier discussion of No Country for Old Men when Lewin is getting a shirt off of a group of teenagers that he encounters on the bridge. Mm-hmm. And Chigurh finds himself in the same position as well. And I think that the film's sort of ideas of determinism and predestination, like that sort of quality of No Country for Old Men, it still holds. But I think it's a very capricious film at helping you rebalance the characters in your mind and what they actually represent or where they stand. And I think in a lot of ways, Anton Chigurh and Lewin Moss are much more similar than they believe.
Right. And you could say the same for, there are parallels and correspondences between Anton Chigurh and Sheriff Ed Tom Bell as well. And I just think about the glass of milk they share, even though they don't share it in person, but they share, and you all almost wonder what they absorb from each other. That car crash scene, I just want to point out, there are moments in this film that are, I feel like I'm just getting a pure injection of Cormac McCarthy, and there are moments where I go, that's a Coen Brothers touch.
Sure.
And the car crash scene toward the end has two of them. One thing, just the way it's shot, most filmmakers would give you a close-up of the driver and then shoot out the side window to show you the truck coming toward you or whatever's coming towards you. They shoot out the other window. They shoot them in profile looking the other way, so you have no idea when it's coming. And the other thing, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in that first shot that you see is post-collision. It's you hear it, and it's just this sound like as brutal. I think the sound design in this movie is also incredible. Just
Skip Livesey is their sound designer. Has been sound editor, been doing it for all their films.
He just like the thwack of every single both the bullets that you hear in this movie and the cattle gun, which is this softened kind of like this perforated kind of sound that it's already done by the time you hear it. And you just kind of get that ruthless causality that I think that both the Coen brothers and Cormac McCarthy love. Just this sort of idea that however on top of it your characters think they are, they're just getting they're convincing themselves of that. And I think that a lot of this movie is about the folly of belief. And it's interesting to think about Cormac McCarthy's his lack of sort of designated religion, his refusal to really buy into organized religion as an individual, despite the very fire and brimstone nature of his writing, just because I think that he sees all of these characters as play actors in a way. They're embodying something that, to your earlier point, no longer truly exists. And I think that the brutality of this movie, the way that these characters meet their ends, the fact that they're even denied that kind of glory that is associated with the death of the cowboy, the death of the lawman, is just one of those ways that the title of the film ultimately holds true. It's just it's a film about the folly of trying to continue past the point where something has ended.
Right.
And I think that's also the Tommy Lee Jones performance is just tremendous in that sense of this character really through these abstract figures that he's chasing through the Texas desert. it leads him to this inner contemplation of whether he has a place in this world still. And in many ways, he's the character who has the developed emotional journey just through those monologues.
Yeah. It's something you said a little earlier struck a chord with me when it really does feel like an Old Testament tale, but just one without God.
Yeah. Well, this is his book. This is his book of Revelation. This is his, like, if you're looking at, like, the border trilogies, the Gospels, and Cormac McCarthy's thing, this is the Revelation. This is the second coming and all the destruction of the second coming. Right. And so it's either no God or just the worst God that you could imagine.
Tommy Lee Jones, Tom Bell says at the end, I always thought when I'd get older, God would come into my life, and he didn't.
And I don't blame him.
He's got the same opinion of me that I have of him.
I always figured when I got older, God would sort of come into my life somehow. He didn't. I don't blame him. If I was him, I'd have the same opinion of me that he does.
Oh, I want to just quickly return to something else you said about when Carla Jean has that scene. It just occurred to me now that there is maybe at least one other example in the Coen brothers filmography. Women come in toward the end of their movies and just call the guys on their bullshit. And I'm thinking of Fargo famously, where she just says to Gare, it's just money. Don't you understand that? And in a different way, Carla Jean serves the same purpose here. And she's such a good character and such a good performance that I wish there'd been more of her in the film.
She and I think this thing about it is that she doesn't have a place in this cosplay that the characters are acting out. She's just the wife, and in many ways she's the witness and the one who sees things most clearly, because she doesn't see herself as a cowboy. She doesn't see herself as any kind of Western figure who needs to kind of, stake her claim upon the land. She just she wants it to end. She wants, people to come home.
But in the McCarthy universe, that makes her collateral damage.
Exactly. And in the Coen brothers universe, that makes her comedic relief, but also sort of a moral compass. You do think about Marge a little bit, about Marge Gunderson from Fargo, and this, just the absurdity of the violence of Fargo, I think, is what kind of keeps it more comedic. But in a lot of ways, the existential anguish and the dread is the same. It's the same sort of idea of just the violence that men do, just in pursuit of or reverence of the dollar. Like that's just all they care about. It's ultimately the destruction of everything. I think that that's also something that in a more oblique way connects Cormac McCarthy to the Coen brothers, is just their critiques of capitalism and their critiques of sort of an American system. And in McCarthy's work, it's really this idea of imposing order over this, and that the sort of the hubris of that, of thinking that you can create a system to run the world. And I think for the Coens as well, there's just this, I think that in their view, that system doesn't account for the peculiarity of human behavior and human nature. And I think that in that way, they come together quite nicely through this adaptation.
I would say that McCarthy looks at hubris and just pitilessly tears it apart, whereas the Coens traditionally just mock it and mock the people who have it, and I'm thinking of Barton Fink as one of the earliest examples of somebody who just has presumptions and just is destroyed and laughed at for having those presumptions. And I want to ask you something about the Coens, because this is the first film in a run of films where, so I've always thought of the Coen brothers as really the cinematic equivalent analog to Steely Dan.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. First of all, there are two of them. Second of all, their irony runs through every particle of their work, and yet beneath that irony, there's a seriousness of purpose and a seriousness of craft that is absolutely, undeniable and not to be tampered with. But there's also, flawed, ridiculous characters running through both their work, and there's the sense, there's the question of what they actually mean, when they actually mean it. Where's the sincerity? Does sincerity even have a purpose? So I remember when I first saw No Country for Old Men in 2007, being almost shocked and feeling like this was the first movie where the Coen brothers meant it. Capital M, capital I. And did they? Maybe they didn't. Maybe this is just the movie in which they decide, well, we're just going to play it straight and pretend we mean it. And that said, it works perfectly, within that framework. And the films that follow, the film that immediately followed it, Burn After Reading, is to me one of their worst movies. I'm not a fan of that movie, except for Brad Pitt's performance. I think it's just silly.
I think they reverse it. They with Burn After Reading, they go from the movie that is their most sparse and their most elemental in terms of its plotting to their most intentionally intricately convoluted and just tangled movie. And to me, I see those as two sides of the coin. But the film that follows Burn After Reading is to me, there's a trilogy of their best work, and it's No Country for Old Men, A Serious Man, True Grit. And I think all three of them are stone masterpieces. And A Serious Man is, to me, it's a movie I hold absolutely dear for a number of reasons. It's a movie I probably will want to talk about in this series at some point. It's a movie that literally ends with apocalypse. Yes, I adore that movie.
I love it to death. And True Grit, I think, has aspects of both films, and it is so much superior to the original True Grit that it's not even funny. But in all three of those films, I feel like they are coming to terms with a seriousness of purpose that does not dilute their formal joy and craft and their almost unholy glee in putting characters through it. So, and after that, what did they do after that? They went from that to, they made Inside Llewyn Davis, which is a movie a lot of people love, and I'm kind of lukewarm on. But I understand that people love it, and and then after that, I think it was Hail Caesar, which is a movie a lot of people hate, but I adore just because for the old Hollywood stuff. But it's still not it's not even remotely one of their serious films. And then they just have seemed to sort of gone on they did Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which was a Netflix, episodic film. And then Joel made Macbeth, and it's just like it's almost, I fear that they kind of exhausted themselves with this trio of really just monumental, again, almost biblical masterpieces.
It's funny that, there is this quote, I think it was Joel Cohen who said this, and this was before True Grit, but he said, "We only adapt Homer and Cormac McCarthy." And those are, and then of course Charles Portis they add later with True Grit. But I think that there is, I think you could also just add that, they're always adapting the Bible in some way, with A Serious Man being so tied to the Book of Job as well. And I think that they find, ways to tie that to this idea of putting characters through it. They're like, what is the ultimate text that does that? And of course, now they've added Shakespeare with the tragedy of Macbeth, but I think it really is always going back to that idea of biblical reckoning for them. And I wonder if they do genuinely feel like they ended something with that trilogy, and even specifically with No Country for Old Men, not only because of the film and the fact of it, but the fact that it was also, if I'm not mistaken, one of their, the most acclaimed films that they had made. And they won Best Picture for it. Bardem won Best Supporting Actor. It just it brought them to a new level of acclaim with something that I think that they would probably argue is one of the greatest books ever written. And it's just, how do you kind of continue on that thread without feeling like you're that you're not reprising things a little bit too directly? Because that's another thing. We haven't really gotten into talking about it, but the critic Adam Naiman, who I think we both know, has, he's written a book on the Coens. And one of the threads that he really pulls through their whole filmography is that idea of circularity and that idea of events repeating. And that's something that I wonder how that manifests for them in their lives and in their idea of what they want to do as filmmakers. Because I think that there's a quality that No Country for Old Men that really another Coen Brothers quote captures better to me than anything, which is, if it's not old and it's not new, it's a folk song. It's that from Inside Llewyn Davis. It's just that idea that they're looking to pull on something that, as soon as it is etched, will outlive them and will outlive, whichever generation, whichever era they live in. And I think that that's also what Cormac McCarthy is after. And I think that that's really where they come together, is that idea of creating something for time memorial. And that's something I just don't think that you can do time and time again, especially when you're packing it with as many philosophical ideas as films like No Country for Old Men and The Serious Man contain.
Yeah. And I mean, A Serious Man, I you can analyze that film through the, through the fable of Schrodinger's cat. Everything in that film can be refracted through that. Just you can get a doctoral dissertation out of that. And both those films, this isn't true of True Grit, but both those films end with such finality, with such ferocious, terrifying finality in different ways. No Country for Old Men has one of the greatest cuts to black I've just seen. It literally takes your breath out of your body. And so does so does A Serious Man in a completely different way. And where do you go from there? Where do you, maybe it's time to just make a silly Hollywood comedy.
I mean, not to keep quoting Coens at you, but it's the Big Lebowski. It's the Big Lebowski. It's it's like the plan being explained to him, and he's like, the beauty of the plan is its simplicity. Once a plan gets too complex, everything can go wrong. And I think that I think they really believe that. And I think that, to kind of circle back to what we were talking about earlier with how the Coen brothers adapt Cormac McCarthy, it's because they have this sort of narrative behaviorism to it. It's just like characters moving through space and time, and then they stop, and so does the movie. And it just has this this brutality, this finality to it, but also there's an existential argument in there too. It's just these characters saying, like, I reckon I go out the same way I came in, and they just. To me, it completely captures that experience of death and that experience of just, the light turns out and then the movie is done. And I think that they probably would buy into that thought about, a film. Every person who makes a film has to decide where to end it. And there is a definitive ending to every film. And I think that they really lean into that. And I think that that's a powerful thing to do, especially when you're working with ideas that are as time old as the ones in No Country for Old Men. They're like, for this biblical story of reckoning, where do we close the book? And they decide to do it with a slam as hard as they can. Yeah, just at that last moment.
Yep. With a moment that is both a journey into the past and a journey into the future and a journey into death. If you think about I want to throw. So I was just thinking about the scene earlier where he goes to visit his uncle. I think it's his uncle, the old man in the house with all the cats.
Yes.
And he's, so one of the themes of this, of the book, or one of the themes that Sheriff Ed Tom Bell is saying throughout the story, is that he doesn't recognize what the West has become, what America has become, that the killers are different, that the violence is different, and it has no reason. And there's this uncle in a wheelchair, this old lawman who says, that's bullshit, man. It's always been like this. And he tells a story of a heinous murder from back in, 1906.
Uncle Mac's death, which was the Ranger versus the Native American used to be the conflict, the Cowboys Indians, that whole idea. And it's so interesting how he dies in the exact same way that Llewyn dies in this film. Sorry, that Llewyn dies.
Yeah.
Not Llewyn Davis, Llewellyn Moss. But he's this welder, and he's going up against drug dealers, and it's a different kind of conflict that's playing out in this space that just terrifies and shakes this lawman who thought he knew the score.
Right, but it's just as meaningless as the history is there. The history is the same.
Yes. So, and the landscape is the same. Is the thing is like, and that's the other thing about the way that the Coens make this movie that makes it such a great Cormac McCarthy adaptation is the treatment of the landscape as just this constant brooding presence that is all around them, and it feels so powerful, the atmosphere at all times, that you can really sense the desperation of these characters as they realize they're never going to escape it. Do
you remember how the movie opens? The movie basically opens with the land. It opens in darkness, and we get this sunrise as we hear Sheriff Ed Tom Bell, voiceover on the soundtrack. But it's just you're watching the land wake up. You're watching the land be born. That it's the stage that the movie's going to take place in. It's just so
absolutely
filmed. Yeah.
In the script, they literally say in that opening, sort of on that first page, they're just like shots of landscape, no people. Like that's just, and of course the script is written in this beautiful McCarthyian sort of tersity as well, where it's just like there's not a wasted word in the entire script. I think it clocks it under 100 pages. But yeah,
and very little dialogue, which apparently freaked the actors out. Josh Brolin was on record as just saying, "I'd never been in a movie with as little dialogue, and it scared me. I didn't know what to do with myself until I sort of figured out what to do with myself."
Whereas Tommy Lee Jones is just loving it. And you can just tell that he is such a man of that same cloth. I mean, he literally has a cattle ranch in Texas, and like that's his non-acting life. And there was this I can't remember where I saw this. It wasn't last night when I was watching the film, but there was a behind-the-scenes featurette where they were talking about a line of dialogue that he's delivering, and Joel comes in and he says, "Cut to the." Like he like just the word "the." He's like cut. You don't need that word. So you could, and he lights up, and he's like, "Of course, I never needed the "the," and it's like, and
Before we finish talking, I want to ask you about a movie that you and other people I know prize very highly, that was taken by many, many other critics as a notorious disaster. I need to see it again. I remember finding it ridiculous when I first saw it, and this is The Counselor. This is the one movie that Cormac McCarthy was not adapted from a book, but that he wrote the screenplay for.
Absolutely.
And you say it's one of your favorite films of the 21st century. I would like to hear why. I'd like to, before I go out and watch it again, because I really do need to see it again. So it's from 2013. It's directed by Ridley Scott. It's got an incredible cast: Michael Fassbender, Penelope Cruz, Cameron Diaz, who has a remarkable scene involving the windshield of a car, and Javier Bardem. Anyway, just for the defense, please.
Thank you for summoning me to the bench. But so The Counselor, I will say, I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say it's one of my favorite films of the 21st century, though I am in a very generous mood with everything with Cormac McCarthy these days. I just, I can't believe I lived at the same time as that writer for a period of my life. That's how I feel about Cormac McCarthy's work. But the thing about The Counselor And the thing about Cormac McCarthy writing screenplays is that he bends the convention of the screenplay towards his style rather than the other way around. You can sit down and read the script for The Counselor, and it would feel like reading a Cormac McCarthy novel. And I think that outside of the sort of acclaim that of the prestige that the Coen brothers bring to No Country for Old Men, and the just absolutely magnificent aesthetics and film techniques that they use to kind of tell that story, and to tell No Country for Old Men as well, one of his more acclaimed novels. I think that people who are unfamiliar with Cormac McCarthy's style and his interests were not able to sort of sense it on the screen in as direct a way as people could with No Country for Old Men. Especially because Ridley Scott is someone who does not take the Coen brothers approach of creating a universe through light and shadow. That is the sort of design of No Country for Old Men, how it looks and how it feels, is not one of the things that's replicated in The Counselor. But what the script does do, and what the story really tells, is another sort of very No Country for Old Men-esque story of hubris and masculinity and just the powerlessness of people to really prevent the fates that they set in motion for themselves. And the film, for those unfamiliar with it, follows a counselor, a legal counselor, who's played by Michael Fassbender, who gets in with very violent Mexican cartels and finds himself very quickly over his head, and in this mess of backstabbings and merciless cartel killings that he really has no escape from. And I think that there's some scenes in that movie that just completely capture the Cormac McCarthy attitude towards the West and towards specifically the border in The Counselor. That's really, I would say, what differentiates it from No Country for Old Men, is that it is about this character who is a Texas lawyer, and he crosses the border, and that becomes this existential line that he can't undo. And it pulls everything in his world into chaos and into darkness. And I think that there are so many connections between The Counselor and No Country for Old Men that it's absolutely worth a look if you like that film. But just be prepared for it to be really pure, uncut Cormac McCarthy. This is not the narratively sparse and evocative Coen treatment. This is Ridley Scott holding the camera on Cormac McCarthy, on Michael Fassbender, as he is whispering sweet nothings that only Cormac McCarthy could have written to Penelope Cruz in bed, about comparing her body parts to the most luscious in all of Christendom, and that kind of level of verbosity. And I think that if you love Cormac McCarthy, and if you believe in the power of his very scriptural, sort of arcane and cryptic monologues that he is so unrivaled at writing, you can get with The Counselor. But if you go in and expect it to move like a normal thriller, you'll be baffled by the things that these characters say to each other. And but there are ways in which I think The Counselor is in some ways a more up-to-date Cormac McCarthy adaptation. It's a more modern Cormac McCarthy than No Country for Old Men, in part because it features one of his best female characters, who is the character played by Cameron Diaz, Malkina, who has pet cheetahs and is truly an animal herself, and is one of these figures of chaos akin to Anton Chigurh, but she uses sex as a weapon, and she is cunning in a way that I think, unlike Anton Chigurh, she actually is completely ahead of the equation. And I think that the other piece of The Counselor that compares to No Country for Old Men is its connection to money, and its connection to money as the root of evil. I think that Cormac McCarthy has moved from sort of the earlier tenor of his work, like Blood Meridian, where it really is blood is the currency. And he has sort of moved towards a system where money is blood and money is currency, and money is the thing that ultimately brings about the destruction of all of the characters. And perhaps that was the Coen brothers rubbing off on him in some sense.
Another point of comparison I'll make between the two films is that they both have a fascination with process. People don't talk in his movies; they do, and I'm thinking of the traps people set for each other in both movies, and there's just and in both books. And I've read the screenplay for The Counselor, and the attention to. So there's a killing early in The Counselor where a guy on a motorcycle, a courier on a motorcycle, is beheaded on a backcountry road, and just the way that scene is set up, the way he puts so much attention to how that's going to happen. It reminds me of similar scenes of how people set up things that they hope will happen in No Country for Old Men, and they may get that short-term result, but it doesn't keep them alive. It doesn't put the universe in order. Quite the contrary.
It's this idea, I think, that idea of conquest is something that is very key to the Cormac McCarthy ethos and to all of his work. And the idea of conquest as being this outdated generational idea, and something where you can seize your little victory, but the world is going to change, and the order of that world is going to change with it. And in the same way, I would say, if No Country for Old Men is about generational push to a degree, then The Counselor is about philosophical transition as well, and just this kind of different accounting of the way that the world works that he is not prepared for as a man who really lives his life by a certain book that no one else has read.
Right. Well, that makes me want to go see the movie again. And dear listeners, I hope it makes you want to both go revisit No Country for Old Men and check out The Counselor. Maybe we should have you back and we can go further into detail about it.
Absolutely.
So that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Isaac, for coming on the podcast. In upcoming weeks, keep an ear out for new episodes of the WatchCast, where my guests will include film critics Manola Dargis, Wesley Morris, Gone Girl author Gillian Flynn, and many others. I am Ty Burr, and you are listening to Ty Burr's WatchCast, part of the Substack newsletter Ty Burr's Watch List. You can find more podcasts, reviews, and tips to navigating the streaming video landscape at tyburswatchlist.substack.com. Thank you, Isaac Feldberg, for being my guest, and thank you, listeners, for listening. So long.